Good morning to my favorite 10 history students that watch this. This is Mrs. Wilson Reed's Mystery of History. So hopefully this helps some of you. We are on volume 2, of course. Lesson 76, The Black Death of Europe. Dun dun dun! Black Death doesn't really come in colors. But if there were one color to best describe the medieval plague, it would be black. The Black Death of the 14th century killed about 25 million people in Europe. That was about 1/3 of the total population. For that reason, the Black Death has been labeled by some as the worst disaster in history. The Black Death was a form of bubonic plague. The bubonic plague gets its name from the buboes or glands that swell on a person with the illness. These buboes were known to swell as large as an egg under the armpit and in the groin. Oftentimes the blood under the skin turned dark purple in patches, giving the appearance of black spots. So the medieval plague has been labeled the Black Death. Its other symptoms included fever and the vomiting of blood. For centuries, the cause of the Black Death was a mystery. That is one reason why it killed so many people. No one understood it well enough to prevent it. This plague wasn't particular about whom it killed either. It took the lives of the young, the old, the rich, and the poor. It killed kings, peasants, priests, and even doctors. The death toll was beyond our imagination. So many died that there wasn't time or place for proper burial. Some were not buried at all, which added gross images of death and stench to the already horrible situation. The real culprit. Though no one understood the plague then, it is known now for being spread by rats and fleas. That's right, rats and tiny fleas. Actually, the real culprit is a germ called Pasteurella pestis. It invades the bodies of rats and eventually kills them. But before the rat dies, the germ is picked up by fleas that live on its body. This is so gross. The germ doesn't kill the flea, rather it multiplies in the flea's little stomach. It is really the flea that carries the plague to other rats or humans by biting them and injecting the bad germs. Of course, fleas always bite because they survive by sucking blood from other creatures. It's just the way God designed them to live. But few survive the spread of the plague. Depending on which strain was passed on, a person could die from within 1 to 5 days of being infected. Most died in 3 days. You can only imagine the confusion in people's minds when they saw others dying so quickly. Some believed it was the wrath of God against the Crusaders. Others thought it was the fault of the Jews. A group of fanatics known as the Flagellant Brothers walked through the towns, whipping themselves as punishment for the plague. They were named for the flagellants, or whips that they carried to beat themselves with. Most people assumed that the plague was contagious when in fact not all strains were. Only those with infected lungs could pass it to others by coughing or spewing their germs through the air. It was the fleas that were the primary carrier of the plague, not infected victims. So despite all the efforts made by people to avoid the disease, people died from it anyway. Kings and queens hid in their castles, monks hid in their monasteries, and priests hid in their churches. Still, many of them died from the Black Death. Townsmen tried to burn the plague away by torching homes and clothes of the deceased. Still, many died. Often when the plague would strike a village, people would panic and run to the next village to escape it. What they did instead was take the germ with them through their flea-infested belongings or the germs in their lungs. And so, the plague was spread from town to town like a wildfire out of control. It didn't help that the cleanliness was not a priority in the cities. Europeans were notorious for dumping their sewage, which is human waste, right out their windows and onto the street. They were at least courteous enough in some places to first yell, "Guardezolo," which would interpret as "look out below." Can you imagine? Let's not. The spread of death. You may be wondering what started the Black Death in the first place. Well, like all diseases, it is difficult to pin down exactly what started it. Only God knows the answer to that. But it seems that the medieval plague first flared up somewhere in Asia. It killed about 13 million people there. After that, the plague seemed to spread easily to Europe through trading ships on the Black Sea. For where there are traders, there are usually ships, and where there are ships, there are plenty of rats, and where there are rats, there are fleas. I think you get the point. It was the world-traveling flea that was most responsible for spreading the deadly disease, but no one figured that out until 1904, nearly 600 years later. Historians believe that the first traders to pick up the plague from Asia were Italians who lived on the coast of the Black Sea. It was there in the trade city of Kaffa that the Italians were exposed to the plague. How? Well, it's rather gruesome. But it seems that a group of raiding Mongols purposely spread the disease as part of a war tactic. Teacher, edit the following italicized sentence as needed. We're in dry. I'm going to read it. They did this by catapulting infected dead bodies, fleas and all, over the wall of the city. In modern times, we would call that biological warfare. It's been around a long time. Resuming reading here. I read what they said. Okay. Anyway, when the Italians fled from Kaffa by ship, they naturally carried the Black Death with them to the port city of Genoa, Italy. From there, it spread all over Europe. The plague reached Paris and London by 1348 and spread to Scandinavia and Russia by 1349. 2/3 of the students at Oxford University died in England. 50,000 were buried in London. Towns in Germany, Persia, France, and Italy were all hit. Few places, if any, were left untouched, although practicing Jews were less affected by the plague. This was probably due to their strict sanitation laws as laid out by the Lord in Deuteronomy. That's an interesting reminder of the wisdom found in God's Word. Results of the Black Death. The results of the Black Death were, of course, devastating because it killed millions of people in a few years, but it was actually 50 years before it left Europe for good. And even those who didn't die from the plague suffered. It took away the butchers, the bakers, and the candlestick makers. It especially robbed Europe of its farmers. The few who were left to work had to work harder. Peasants across Europe revolted against these unfair conditions by demanding higher pay or refusing to work at all. The system of feudalism, where people worked for the lord nearest them in exchange for land, began to fall apart. It was growing weaker anyways as the countries of Europe began to take more shape and have stronger governors. On the positive side, the Black Death may have caused many to seek God. It is clear from the heavenly artwork of the early Renaissance that spiritual matters were heavy on people's minds. Coming close to death and dying has a way of doing that to people. We see this clearly in the book of Job, a story in the Bible of a man who suffered many horrible things, including disease, but never blamed God for it. Instead, he sought God for understanding and comfort. Now, before I leave this lesson, I want to clear up something that you might be feeling, and that is fear. You might be afraid that the plague could come back. Well, although anything is possible, it is highly unlikely that the Black Death could ever spread like it did in medieval times. For one, modern man has many powerful antibodies to help treat people with plague symptoms. Rare cases of it that have popped up in the last century have been stopped from spreading. Second, the cause of bubonic plague is now understood. Health officials go to great lengths to control a rat population, especially at ports around the world. Third, most countries today have elaborate methods to handle human waste and sewage, which greatly helps to control any disease. Yay for toilets and indoor plumbing. I hope that knowing these things will help you not to worry about the return of the plague. Our generation has its own disease to take care of, such as cancer and AIDS. These are serious problems now that may be solved one day in the future, but until then, rather than worry, I prefer to look at disease as an ever-present reminder that life is very precious and every day is a gift from God that we can thank God for. The end.